Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. We are approaching 400 subscribers, and I couldn't be more excited. I know we're still a very long way away from my goal of 1,000, but seeing all the views and comments on every video is always amazing. Thank you for all your support, and I would love to do a giveaway if I can once we hit our subscriber goal. Also, shout out to Nick's Lotus, who mentioned me in one of his videos. At the time of recording this, Nick just broke 2,000 subscribers and always delivers quality content ranging from quick daily card highlights, EDH deck techs, and deck reviews sent in by his subscribers. If you love my channel, I know you're going to want to check out Nick's Lotus. Link to his channel will be in the description below. Once again, much love from your friendly neighborhood blue mage. And before we get started in today's video, I do want to apologize. I'm using a different microphone to record this video, and I'm feeling a little bit under the weather, so I do apologize if the sound is different, but that won't stop me from trying to deliver some good quality content. Another thing that I want to mention is that I'm sorry for not being the most consistent creator on the platform. Trying to balance YouTube stuff alongside family and work can get pretty difficult. But I promise, I'm still here and I'm still dedicated on improving my video quality and providing the best Magic the Gathering content that I can. So let's get into today's video. What is the best color in Magic the Gathering? Is it white with Wizards of the Coast pushing some better draw options while having a solid suite of single target exile spells along with their board wipes? Or is it red who wants to make everything you have a hasty powerhouse? Or maybe black that can remove and reanimate everything from little kitty cats to huge eldritch monstrosities? Or my personal choice, blue, with its access to unlimited card advantage and the dreaded counterspell? Or is it what could be considered the most powerful effect in Magic? Ramp, and the color that you'll need to get access to the best ramp spells in the game. The color that gives you access to the thing that you need to even cast your removal, your counterspells, or card draw. That's right, in today's video, we are going to talk about mono green. Remember, if you like what I'm trying to do here, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more Magic the Gathering goodness. As I've mentioned before in my other videos about playing mono colors, you have not experienced the true power of green and its downfalls until you play it alone. But that being said, let's dive deeper into what is arguably Magic the Gathering's most powerful color. Green gives us access to the fundamentals of the game. Sure, every color has access to things like artifact ramp or a way to draw cards, and hopefully draw lands to put them into play. But green, and I guess white now, have the most and best ways to specifically tutor through your deck to put lands on the battlefield, as well as using creatures that are going to tap for mana. Alongside the best ramp spells in the game, green also offers us huge creatures with powerful effects that will give us a payoff for spending an early game ramping with mana dorks or extra lands for the turn. Let's just hit the ground running and let's talk about what makes green special. Something that green is known for and has a wide variety of access to are its many mana dorks, ranging from the simple 1 green that taps for 1 like the Llanowar Elves, Fyndhorn Elves, or Elvish Mystic, or creatures that let you untap lands like Arbor Elf and Argothian Elder to combo with your Nykthos or your Ancient Tomb, all the way to the most extreme mana producers like Bloom Tender for those good multicolor decks, or Priest of Titania for anyone playing elves. And by the looks of it, most of the dorks mentioned so far are elves. And one of my personal favorites, the Circle of Dreams Druid, which is a bit of a green investment, but since we're talking about mono green today, that won't be a problem. And finally, the best one of them all, the Burbs of Paradise. Taps for 1 of any color, become a flying blocker late game. There's nothing not to love about the Burb. Oh yeah, and the crazy new Devoted Halfling that taps for a colorless, or taps of 1 of any color to cast a legendary spell that can't be countered. Because who didn't want a Cavern of Souls on a 1 mana dork? 2 that I wanted to mention before we move on are actually Somberwald Sage and the Shaman of Forgotten Ways. These 2 creatures tap for 2 mana to put towards creature spells, and I feel like they're somewhat underrated when it comes to Commander. They can produce colored mana, but since we're in mono green, they can help us push forward into some big creatures. Honestly, there are so many mana dorks that I really don't want to cover them all, because if I did, this video would probably just be about mana dorks. So pick and play your favorites, and just remember that if it dies to removal, it's a terrible card, don't play it. You don't want to jam your deck too full of mana dorks and forget about the actual land or artifact ramp if that's what you like. Even if you might not have to rely on it as much as the other colors, the worst thing is when you dump all your dorks who have summoning sickness, and then a board wipe happens and it sends you back to the Stone Age with all the other plebes not playing green at the table. Perfectly transitioning us to our next topic, true land ramp. Green specializes in telling us that we can go and get extra lands. There are some special cards outside of green like Archaeomancer's Map, the classic Solemn Simulacrum, Deep Gnome Terramancer, and Wayfarer's Bauble. But green really puts it into overdrive when getting extra lands out or getting them into your hand. Going over a few of the land ramp spells in mono green in mana order, the first one I want to talk about is one called Caravan Vigil. So for 1 green, we search our library for a basic land, reveal it, and put it into our hand at sorcery speed. But what I like about this card is with Morbid, we may put that card onto the battlefield instead of putting it into our hand if a creature died this turn, and it does not say that we put it onto the battlefield tapped. Next up is the classic Crop Rotation. So as an additional cost to cast the spell, we sacrifice a land, search your library for a land, and put it onto the battlefield and shuffle your library. Much like Caravan Vigil, we get to search our library for a land and put it onto the battlefield untapped. And Crop Rotation is at instant speed, so we can use it at an opponent's end step so we can untap with the land that we just tutored for. Next up, we're going to be going over the growing list of super effective land tutors for 2 mana, such as Farseek, which allows us to go and get a plains, island, swamp, or mountain, put it onto the battlefield. This one does enter tapped, but this one will allow us to go get our shock lands or triome lands, so Farseek is always a good inclusion. Another great one from the set of Strixhaven is the Emergent Sequence. So again, for 2 mana, search our library for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield tapped. This land becomes a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature that's still a land, and you put a +1/+1 counter on it for each land you had enter the battlefield under your control this turn. So this card is either going to search us a land to the battlefield. Yes, it is tapped. It does become a creature, which will hurt if it gets something like a board wipe. I don't see why anyone would use removal on a small land, but if we are playing those classic green or other colors we add in as we want to, where we're going to be playing multiple lands a turn, or if we hit a couple land ramp spells late game, Emergent Sequence is going to make the land that we tutor up into a creature, and it's going to make it way bigger, but for now it'll be a 1/1, and then we can just use it as a regular land on our upcoming turns. Next up is Nature's Lore. Search your library for a forest card and put it onto the battlefield. Pretty self-explanatory. This one, again, does not enter tapped. Along with 3 visits, search your library for a forest, put it onto the battlefield. So 3 visits in Nature's Lore are pretty much the same thing. Rampant Growth. Search your library for a basic land. This one does enter tapped. Obviously, the previously mentioned cards, 3 visits and Nature's Lore, much better, but it's always nice to have those redundant effects. And yes, Rampant Growth, again, basic, enters tapped, but it's always nice to make sure you can hit your colors or hit extra land drops if we have a bunch of landfall creatures. Next up is a really interesting one, Restore. So put target land card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So this one is interesting because the land that enters from the graveyard is not tapped, so if an opponent either had a fetch land or something, we can get double landfall effects, or if there possibly was a land destruction player, they're playing Strip Mine, they're playing their Ghost Quarter or whatnot, or if we are even doing some self-mill, or opponents are doing self-mill, they hit a pretty good land like a Nykthos or something, we can then just use Restore, we can put that right onto our battlefield. And this card, honestly, I don't think I've ever heard of this before making this video, but this card honestly seems really solid in a lot of different deck strategies. And the last one we're going to talk about is the classic Steve, the Sakura Tribe Elder. So Steve is just a 1/1, we can just make him hang around as a blocker, we can put him in front of something big, and then Steve says on him that we can sacrifice the Sakura Tribe Elder, search our library for a basic land, battlefield tapped, pretty standard stuff. But Steve is always good in multicolored decks, he's always good in landfall decks, or like the purpose of this video, the mono green decks. So Steve is going to sit around, he can be an early game ramp, or if we get him late game, he can basically just sit around and block for us, and then he can get an opportune land out at the right time. The next are the classics, the ones that are considered the best rampers as they get more than one land, with things like Cultivate and Kodama's Reach, which I'm pretty sure you are all familiar with, but I'm just going to go ahead and go over them. You get to tutor for 2 basic lands, one goes onto the battlefield tapped, one goes into your hand, so super great to make sure that you hit your land for the next turn, as well as getting an extra land out this turn. The next card would be Far Wanderings. Search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped. Pretty standard again, but this has Threshold. If 7 or more cards are in your graveyard, instead search your library for up to 3 basic land cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped. So they still enter tapped, but if we get this card late game and we hit that threshold where we have 7 or more cards, we don't even really need to be self-milling with the amount of lands that we could be sacrificing, or just creatures dying due to board wipes or attacking or blocking, whatever. Far Wanderings getting us 3 lands. 3 lands for 3 mana seems like a really solid return. Next up is Harrow, which is the crop rotation but for 3 mana. It's at instant speed. We sacrifice a land. We search a library for up to 2 basic lands, put them onto the battlefield. So again, these are untapped, which is really important. So we're going to tap a land, obviously, to cast the Harrow. We're going to sacrifice our tapped land. We're going to get 2 untapped lands. So more or less, Harrow basically costs 1 green mana. We can do this at instant speed as well. Along with the Harrow is Roiling Regrowth, which again is at instant. We sacrifice a land, search for 2 basics, put on the battlefield tapped. Unfortunately, so this one will make the lands enter tapped, but it's really similar to Harrow, and I wanted to mention it. The next card I want to talk about is becoming one of my favorites in a lot of my creature-heavy decks. This is Harvest Season. So search your library for X basic land cards, where X is the number of tapped creatures you control, and put those cards onto the battlefield tapped. So yes, they're entering tapped, which does suck, but we get to search for X. So if we either go wide with something like making a bunch of elf tokens, or if we have a lot of elementals or whatnot, whatever mono green does, whatever your strategy is in mono green, we can swing out. We have 6 tapped creatures now that we just attacked with. We cast a Harvest Season, we go get 6 lands, and that's not even counting things like landfall triggers, but just going up 6 lands, you're immediately going to become the threat. So Harvest Season is really good, and I would encourage you to put it into your creature-heavy decks. Next up is Spring Bloom Druid, so for all of you Blink players, or if you just want your ramp tied to a creature. So Spring Bloom Druid is just going to Roiling Regrowth, but it's on a creature. So when it enters, we sacrifice the land, we search for 2 basic lands, and they enter tapped. Next up is going to be Beanstalk Giant, and not the actual creature side, but I wanted to talk about this card. It fits nicely into this 3 slot that I'm currently talking about. So we pay 3 mana, we cast the Fertile Footsteps as a sorcery adventure, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. So it does enter untapped, which is really important. And then when we cast this for its adventure cost, we're going to put the Beanstalk pile in our adventure pile, or whatever it's called. So it's going to hang out there until we're ready to cast it later for 7 mana, and the Beanstalk Giant's power and toughness is equal to the number of lands you control. And the last one is my personal favorite, one of the cards that I remember picking up that really seemed to just excel my Magic gameplay and my Magic knowledge, just making all my decks more solid, is Wood Elves. So Wood Elves enters the battlefield. We search our library for a forest, put it onto the battlefield. Again, very important, it's untapped. We get a forest, so in those 3 color decks we can go and get our Shocklands, we can go get the Triomes. Unfortunately, those will enter tapped, and then it just becomes a 1/1 blocker unless we are blinking or flickering it, which is always super nice. But Wood Elves is just such a solid card in my opinion, one of my favorites of all time in Magic. And now it's time for the big boys, the ones with the high mana cost and the higher payoff. So we're going to talk about things like Skyshot Claim, which again should be pretty standard to all you veteran Magic players, and Explosive Vegetation. So Skyshot Claim is nice. It's a sorcery for 4 mana, allows you to search for 2 forests and put them onto the battlefield. So this will go and get 2 untapped forests. So you can go and get those Shocklands, those Triomes, you can just bring them right out. There are other things on the list that I've mentioned before that just seem to get a better payoff, but I wanted to just mention Explosive Vegetation for anyone who needed a hit of nostalgia today. Next up we're going to talk about is Tempt with Discovery. So this one is interesting. It's 4 mana, but it has Tempting Offer. So we search our library for a land card and put it onto the battlefield. Then each opponent may also search their library for a land and put it onto the battlefield. Each opponent who searches their library this way, you search your library for an additional land. So these lands don't enter the battlefield tapped. You go and get any land you want. You're going to go and get your best land out of your entire library. It comes in untapped. You can go get your Thespian Stage, your Nykthos, your Gaia's Cradle, because I know all of you are playing Gaia's Cradle. And lastly, we're going to talk about a newer card that I'm actually really enjoying putting in my green deck is Vorinclex. So for 5 mana, we get a 6/6 Trample Reach creature. So we're paying 5 mana for a creature with extra power and toughness and has 2 keywords. When Vorinclex enters the battlefield, you search your library for 2 forest cards, reveal them, put them into your hand, and then shuffle. So Vorinclex doesn't ramp us to the traditional way of getting those lands out, but he puts those cards into our hand, which is really nice. And then Vorinclex also, you pay 8 mana, 6 green, exile Vorinclex, and you flip him, you turn him transformed, and you can only activate this as a sorcery. I'm not going to spend time talking about Vorinclex's flip side, but it just does a bunch of cool stuff. So Vorinclex comes in as a creature with trample and reach as a blocker, and then we can transform him once we have enough mana, and we can just get his extra effects, flip Vorinclex back into the creature side, and go get 2 more forests. Now we're going to talk about the real top end stuff, the things that if you're casting, you pretty much should be winning the game off of. And these 2 cards I wanted to talk about are Boundless Realms and Reshape the Earth. So Boundless Realms is 7 mana, 6 and a green. At sorcery speed, search your library for X basic lands, where X is the number of lands you control. Put them onto the battlefield tapped, shuffle your library. So this should just, again, be getting all the lands out of your library, hitting all of your landfall triggers. Your next turn that you untap, or if you have something like an Amulet of Vigor, you make all these lands enter untapped. You should just be having enough mana to hit all your landfall triggers, and then casting big spells to win the game. And the next is Reshape the Earth. So for 6 green, so 9 mana, sorcery speed, search your library for up to 10 land cards, put them on the battlefield tapped. So again, this is going to go get any land. If you want utility lands, your multicolored lands, whatever you want, whatever you're going to need. Again, just I keep harping on this fact of hitting landfall triggers, but that's really what mono green has going for it, especially with getting 10 lands out. So something like a Scoot Swarm or something, you're pretty much just going to win on the spot. Green also allows us ways to play extra lands without searching our library, to clear our hand out and hit our landfall triggers more than once per turn. Things that are going to allow us to play extra lands are things like Burgeoning and Exploration and Explore. The Burgeoning is 1 mana for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent plays a land, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield, and Exploration, you may play an additional land on each of your turns. So these 2 cards are doing something similar, and honestly, they're nice, especially when you compare them with some card draw or land tutors to your hand. But I've noticed that when I've played Burgeoning, I tend to run out of lands in my hand, and suddenly Burgeoning tells the other table that you are the first threat, especially if you play it on turn 1 and you jump ahead to such an early lead. Explore is nice because it allows us to draw a card and play an additional land, so if we play it early enough, it's going to accelerate us at least 1 land. Then we have things like Azusa, Lost but Seeking, Wayward Swordtooth, and Dryad of the Elysian Grove, all of which allow us to play at least 1 additional land. Azusa allows us to play 2, and that's all she does. The Wayward Swordtooth is a 5/5 for 3 mana with Ascend, so if we control 10 or more permanents, we get the City's Blessing, and then Wayward Swordtooth can both attack and block. And Dryad of the Elysian Grove is probably the strongest out of these 3, so we can play additional land, and lands we control are every basic land type in addition to their other types. So if you're needing to tap for certain colors, or if you get a card that allows you to search for a forest, you can then and just go get any land that you want. So it only is every basic land, so you can't go and get your shock lands, but every land being every basic land type, you can go get a mountain, you can go get a swamp if you're tutoring through your deck. And lastly is Oracle of Moldiah, one of the early staples of Commander. If you had this card in your deck in the early days, this really set you apart. So the Oracle of Moldiah is 4 mana for a 2/2, but you can play an additional land on each of your turns. You also play with the top card of your library revealed, and you may play lands from the top of your library. But it's really just going to serve to clear off the top of your library so you can get to your other things, whatever you're needing at the moment, so you're not just top decking straight lands. And next up is a category that I'm calling Turn Everything into Birds, or just Dorks, I guess in this case. These effects will help us turn all of our creatures into mana dorks, and these things are going to be cards like Cryptolith Rite and Earthcraft. So Cryptolith Rite's 2 mana enchantment. Creatures you control have tap and add 1 mana of any color, so it literally turns them into a Birds of Paradise. And Earthcraft, I know this one I think is on the reserve list and pretty pricey these days, but you tap an untapped creature and you can untap a basic land. So a lot of things go infinite with Earthcraft. If you have something where you can pay an ability into to make creature tokens, or you can flicker something. Earthcraft is nice because it gets around Summoning Sickness. Cryptolith Rite adds the ability tap add 1, so if they are summoning sick they can't do it, but Earthcraft just says tap an untapped creature, so much like Urza, you can just tap a creature that entered the battlefield this turn and untap a land. Next up is a really interesting card. It's Jaheira, Friend of the Forest. Jaheira's 3 mana for a 2/3 human elf druid. Tokens you control have tap, add 1 green. You can choose a background if you want to make this your commander, but we're just going to talk about the creature. So Jaheira says that tokens we control, so that means things like clue tokens, our treasure tokens that we make, our creature tokens, obviously, but if we're making other things like artifact tokens or non-creature tokens, we can just tap those right away. And I think Jaheira is very overlooked. It would give us a huge boost, especially in today's EDH economy, where we are just pumping out treasures left and right. And lastly, we're going to talk about Ashaya, Soul of the Wild. Ashaya is a 5 mana star, so Ashaya's power and toughness is equal to the number of lands you control, so very similar to Beanstalk Giant. Non-token creatures you control are forest lands in addition to their other types. And why this is interesting is it allows our non-token creatures to tap for green because they become forests. But Ashaya also, what I found interesting is a lot of removal will say exile target non-land permanent or something of that effect. And Ashaya basically protects our entire board because she makes them into lands. Next up are a few cards that I felt needed to be mentioned in a special cards section that didn't really have a space of their own with the ones that I had mentioned before this. First one we're going to talk about is Growing Rites of Itlimoc, so a 3 mana enchantment. When Growing Rites of Itlimoc enters the battlefield, we're going to look at the top 4 cards of our library. You may reveal a creature from among them, put it into your hand, put the rest at the bottom. So it's going to just dig through the top, we get to draw a creature. And at the beginning of our end step, if we control 4 or more creatures, which is a pretty easy thing to hit in most EDH decks, we're going to transform the Growing Rites of Itlimoc, which turns it into a land that taps for a green, or gives it the ability to tap for a green for every creature we control. So effectively, Growing Rites of Itlimoc transforms into Gaia's Cradle, which is considered one of the best lands ever printed in Magic, so Growing Rites of Itlimoc needed to be mentioned here. Next is going to be Nissa Vital Force, so a 5 mana planeswalker. +1 untap target land you control until your next turn. It becomes a 5/5 elemental, it's still a land. -3, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. Pretty nice if we need something back in a pinch. But the special thing about Nissa Vital Force in a lot of green decks or decks that are based around lands entering the battlefield is the -6. So Nissa will start at 5 loyalty. She can plus the first turn, and then the next go around we can immediately get her ultimate, her emblem. You get an emblem with whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. So it's a May ability, which is really nice, but we're going to be playing mono green. Lands are going to be entering all the time. Nissa is an all-star that I've seen everywhere across the EDH spectrum that is going to just draw us a bunch of lands, or it's going to draw us a bunch of cards when we play lands. And lastly, we're going to talk about Scapeshift, which is probably one of the best cards that a landfall deck can run. I've been killed by a Scapeshift combo more times than I care to recount. Scapeshift is a 4 mana sorcery. Sacrifice any number of lands. Search your library for that many land cards. Put them onto the battlefield tapped and shuffle. So again, we sacrifice lands. We get lands, not basics. Usually what happens with this is people go and find a Valakut or something of that effect, and they just blast the table. So this Scapeshift is a very popular card, and it is very good and consistent. It is used in a wide variety of decks, and I've been killed by it many times. And finally, as I say all the time, each deck needs ways to interact with their own graveyard, and these cards are fantastic choices when getting lands back from the bin. So first up, we're going to talk about Splendid Reclamation, which goes alongside the Scapeshift that I just mentioned. So you cast Scapeshift, you sacrifice all your lands, you go get new lands, and then you cast Splendid Reclamation, and it says return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Next up is an interesting card, World Shaper. It's a merfolk. So whenever World Shaper attacks, you may mill 3 cards. You do not have to. When World Shaper dies, return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So World Shaper is interesting because it can self-mill for whatever purpose we may need that for, but honestly, when I've played World Shaper, I kind of just hang him back as a blocker. He becomes the ultimate blocker, especially if we have lands in our graveyard. The opponent attacking us now needs to think about, if we block with World Shaper, we are going to get all of our lands in our graveyard back. So if we again sacrifice lands or we milled in any way, World Shaper just becomes the ultimate blocker. Next up is going to be Titania, Protector of Argoth, and Titania, Nature's Force. So the first one's a classic EDH card, so for 5 mana, 3 green green, we get a 5/3 elemental. When Titania, Protector of Argoth enters the battlefield, return target land from our graveyard to the battlefield, so fetch lands or land that had been destroyed. Whenever a land you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, create a 5/3 green elemental creature token. Obviously, you can see where this is going, especially with things like Scapeshift, as I've mentioned before. And the other Titania is a 6 mana, 4 green for a 6/6. You may play forests from your graveyard, which is really nice. Whenever a forest enters the battlefield, you may create a 5/3 green elemental creature token, just like her counterpart. And whenever an elemental you control dies, you may mill 3 cards. So you can just start to put this together and how synergistic all these cards are. And the last two that I'm going to talk about are Raminep Excavator and Perennial Behemoth, which do the exact same thing. So the Raminep Excavator's obviously been a classic for a while now. So 3 mana, 2 and a green for a 2/3 Naga Cleric. You may play lands from your graveyard. And the Perennial Behemoth is a newer card. You may play lands from your graveyard. It's a 2/7 for 5 mana. It's an artifact, but it also has Unearth for green. Return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste and you exile it. Now, after we ramp and we get all of our lands back from our graveyard, we need to talk about the thing that mono green is probably most famous for, and that is landfall. So we are going to talk about the obvious, such as Avenger of Zendikar and Rampaging Baloths. These two are classic EDH staples. When Avenger of Zendikar enters the battlefield, we're going to create a 0/1 green plant creature token for each land we control, and landfall, whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we may put a +1/+1 counter on each plant creature we control. So that does not just put counters on the things that Avenger makes. Obviously it will put counters on those, but if we have other plant creatures, they will also get a +1/+1 counter. And Rampaging Baloths is a 6/6 with trample. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may create a 4/4 green beast. They don't have haste, they don't have trample, but it's just a good way to make some big creatures. Rampaging Baloths is always nice to have around. The next card we're going to talk about is Greensleeves Marrow Sorcerer, a 5 mana star. Protection from planeswalkers and from wizards, so I'm sure that is somewhere deep in the lore of Magic why Greensleeves has that. Greensleeves Marrow Sorcerer's power and toughness is equal to the number of lands we control. Obviously pretty common theme. We've seen that on a number of cards so far. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 3/3 green badger creature token. So Greensleeves functions a lot like Rampaging Baloths. It's 1 mana less, but Greensleeves can be much larger. It has built-in protection, and then it makes 3/3, so obviously 1 power and toughness less than the Rampaging Baloths. Next up is going to be the Scute Swarm. Again, just a classic staple of Commander so far once it was printed. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 green insect, but if you control 6 or more lands, create a token that's a copy of Scute Swarm. So as soon as we hit that 6 land threshold, we're going to make a Scute Swarm, another land enters. Now both of those Scute Swarms are going to check the land that entered, make more Scute Swarms, and so on and so forth. Scute Swarm, especially with a haste enabler, can pretty much just end a game if you're getting multiple lands once you hit that 6 land threshold. Next up is going to be Tireless Provisioner and Tireless Tracker, 2 cards that go pretty well together. Both have landfall, obviously. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a food token or a treasure token with Tireless Provisioner, so that's always a nice thing. You either get ramp or you get life gain. And the Tireless Tracker, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, investigate, you create a clue. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, put a 1/1 counter on the Tireless Tracker. So the Tireless Tracker is going to draw us cards. The Tireless Provisioner is either going to gain us life or ramp us further. Next up is the Grazing Gladeheart, so 3 mana, landfall, whenever a land enters, you gain 2 life. I wanted to just mention this. It's not the biggest effect, but it's always nice to put a little bit of life gain in your deck too. There's always going to be times where you're getting hit, you're paying your life, or someone just decides that they want to kill you first, and it's always nice to just find some way to gain some life back so you can make sure to stay in the game. And lastly, we are going to talk about one of the most impactful things that is going to double everything that we're trying to do is the Ancient Green Warden. So 6 mana, 5/7 with reach. You may play lands from your graveyard, so it includes that ability. And if a land entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So lands entering, triggering other lands, triggering our landfall creatures, we just get to double those. Ancient Green Warden might be the most impactful landfall creature that there is, because we get to play lands from our graveyard and double our landfall things. It doesn't have a landfall trigger on itself, but doubling everything is just going to go crazy. So Ancient Green Warden's pretty awesome. And lastly, we are going to talk about land payoffs. These are just a couple of cards I wanted to mention. Just like the special section before, I didn't really know where to put these, but I wanted to mention them. So Multani Yamavia's Avatar, 6 mana for a 0/0 instead of a star, which I thought was interesting. Reach and Trample, Multani gets a +1/+1 for each land you control and land in your graveyard, so Multani can come down and just be huge, and having Reach can block those pesky flyers, and having Trample can honestly just end someone. Then we can also pay 2 mana, 1 and a green, and return 2 lands we control to our hand, to their owner's hand. So if we have someone else's lands, we can give their lands back if we ever wanted to do that for some reason. Return Multani from your graveyard to your hand. So Multani is just going to be really hard to get rid of. And lastly is Nissa, who shakes the world. One of the most impactful planeswalkers in a mono green deck. Whenever you tap a forest for a mana, add an additional green. So this can be our triomes or whatever if we're playing this in a non-mono green deck, but all of our basics are going to be forest. Basically just doubles our mana output from our lands. Nissa has a +1 and a -8, so the +1 you put 3 counters on a target land, untap it, it becomes a 0/0 elemental with vigilance and haste, it's still a land. Just remember that board wipes or target removal can now get rid of this land. This +1 will allow us to untap a land so we can tap it, use the +1, untap it, tap it again. So that just allows us to ramp even further than we already had. And the -8. You get an emblem with lands you control have indestructible. Search your library for any number of forest cards and put them on the battlefield tapped and shuffle your library. So again, if Nissa wasn't already breaking the game with her static ability, her -8 is just going to close the game for you. So we just spent a lot of time talking about what green does well, and I think you guys know me well enough to know that this isn't really what the series is about. Sure, green ramps like a champion and contains some huge beaters that are sure to scare even the most secure control mage, but what does green struggle with? What can't this color do? Well, the answer to that question is it struggles with removal. Sure, green has its specialty spot when it comes to removal like all colors do, but green needs to have some sort of drawback. Green specializes in removing enchantments and artifacts with ease, but usually has a harder time hitting creatures. So I'm going to highlight some of green's best target removal, where hitting anything like Beast Within, Song of the Dryads, and Desert Twister, which is really interesting, the Desert Twister being 6 mana, destroy target permanent, so I guess we could take out a land, but Beast Within is probably green's most famous removal spell, and Song of the Dryads enchant target permanent, it becomes a colorless forest land, so much like the blue version of that card, the Song of the Dryads, we can just hit anything, whereas Imprisoned in the Moon, we cannot hit anything, so these cards will hit, they will take care of anything that we're having a problem with. Next up are things that only hit certain things, such as Reclamation Sage, Krosan Grip, Acidic Slime. These cards are going to come in to destroy target artifact or enchantment. It's really nice having the Reclamation Sage on a creature if we're running any sort of reanimation. The Krosan Grip is an instant, which is really nice and has split second, so as long as the spell's on the stack, players can't add spells to the stack, so more or less Krosan Grip can't be countered. And Acidic Slime, it's a 2/2 with Death Touch, so it's a pretty great blocker. It enters its artifact, enchantment, or land, so those pesky Urborgs or Cabal Coffers we can take out. Next up would be things like Terastodon, Force of Vigor, and Kenrith's Transformation. So I wanted to talk about Terastodon because this is probably one of the early cards that we've all experienced. It's a 9/9 for 8 mana. When Terastodon enters the battlefield, destroy 3 target non-creature permanents. So we can hit lands, we can hit artifacts, we can hit enchantments, we can hit everything but creatures, and then our opponents get a 3/3 elephant in return. Then with Force of Vigor, it's an instant for 4 mana. If it's not your turn, you may exile a green spell rather than pay this spell's mana cost. We destroy up to 2 target artifacts or enchantments. It's pretty self-explanatory. And a card that's been making the rounds recently is Kenrith's Transformation. So 2 mana, we get enchant creature. When Kenrith's Transformation enters the battlefield, we draw a card, so it replaces itself, which is really nice. Enchanted creature loses all abilities, and is a green elk creature with tough power toughness 3/3. So it just basically neutralizes their commander or their best creature out. The last two I want to talk about is Naturalize and Lingify. So Naturalize, again, is pretty common in the green sphere of things. Destroy target artifact or enchantment at instant speed is really nice. And I thought Lingify was really interesting. It's a tribal enchantment, Treefolk Aura. We enchant creature, enchanted creature loses all abilities, and it's a tree folk with base power and toughness 0-4. So basically, their commander or their best creature doesn't get indestructible or anything, but it's a 0-4, it's a pretty big toughness, honestly, and it just makes it lose all abilities, so I thought it was worth it to mention. We're not killing a creature, but we're taking all of its abilities away. Next up is going to be the special enchantment and artifact hate, or board wipes, that green has. So the ones that you're probably thinking of right away are going to be things like Bane of Progress, Azuri's Predation, and the Whip-Tongue Hydra. So the Bane of Progress comes down and hits all artifacts and enchantments, including our own, and you put a +1/+1 counter on it for each artifact and enchantment destroyed this way. One of green's classic board wipes to get rid of all things. The Whip-Tongue Hydra, it's got reach. When it enters the battlefield, destroy all creatures with flying. Put a 1/1 counter on the Whip-Tongue Hydra for each creature destroyed this way. Very similar to Bane of Progress. Really nice to get rid of flyers, and it has reach to deal with any new flyers that come down. And then finally we have Azuri's Predation, probably green's most famous and best board wipe. For each creature your opponents control, we're going to create a 4/4 beast for each of those tokens. It fights a different one of those creatures, so if there's 20 creatures out, we make 24 4s. We fight everything. So even if an opponent has a 5/5, our 4/4 fights it and would die. But it's going to take care of all those little value creatures that our opponents are just hanging back, not blocking. The next I wanted to talk about cards that really say destroy all on them, and I found these pretty interesting. So first is going to be Whirlwind, Creeping Corrosion, and Serene Heart. Whirlwind. For 4 mana, we're going to destroy all creatures with flying, which is really nice. Again, it's not going to hit anything on the ground, but when we struggle to put out flyers, or if we struggle to have things with reach, we're going to destroy everything with flying, which could honestly hose like dragon decks or token decks that make token flyers or angels or whatnot. Creeping Corrosion, destroy all artifacts. That's going to hit all the treasures. That's going to hit all the mana rocks that other decks are relying on, whereas our green deck, we're just going to get extra lands out and mana dorks. And Serene Heart, 2 mana, destroy all enchantments. So again, this is going to hit our enchantments too, but I think for 2 mana at instant speed, we can take out those pesky Smothering Tides or Rhystic Studies. I think Serene Heart was an interesting card to talk about. Next up, we're going to talk about Back to Nature, Reverent Silence, and Rampage of the Clans. So Back to Nature, again, 2 mana, destroy all enchantments. It's the exact same card at instant speed, just as Serene Heart. We have Reverent Silence for 4 mana. If you control a forest, you may have each other player gain 6 life. Instead of paying this card's mana cost, destroy all enchantments. It's at sorcery speed, just another effect in that realm. And Rampage of the Clans, a newer card, destroy all artifacts and enchantments. For each permanent destroyed this way, its controller creates a 3/3 green creature. So I wanted to just throw this in there. It's kind of getting some heat off of you. If you cast this card, you can destroy some artifacts, some enchantments, and then you're giving creatures. More often than not, that opponent's probably going to attack you with those creatures, but it's at instant speed, which is pretty nice. And last but not least, I wanted to mention, I think this card is cool. It's probably overstayed its welcome. It's probably not as good as it once was, but I just think the art is really cool, and I think it looks cool. Tornado Elemental for 7 mana, we get a 6/6. When Tornado Elemental enters the battlefield, deals 6 damage to each creature with flying. Again, not as good as Whirlwind destroying all creatures with flying, but it's a deal 6 damage on a 6/6 body, and you may have Tornado Elemental assign combat damage as though it weren't blocked. So, again, just thought it was kind of cool. And lastly, we are going to talk about the best fight spells. There's not many of them, but I wanted to talk about Ram Through and Tail Swipe. So both at instant speed, Ram Through, target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. If the creature you controlled has trample, excess damage is dealt to the other creature's controller. And Tail Swipe, choose target creature you control and target creature you don't control. If you cast the spell during your main phase, the creature you control gets +1 until end of turn. Those creatures fight each other. So again, 1 mana, instant speed. If you cast it on your turn, you get to buff your creature. Thought it was pretty good. The next area that I always try and make sure to hit in all of my decks is card draw. And honestly, you might be surprised at the amount of card draw that green has access to. First off, we're going to hit the classics like Sylvan Library, Rishkar's Expertise, and Regal Force. Sylvan Library allows us to draw 2 additional cards, and we can keep those if we pay 4 life for each additional card on our upkeep. Rishkar's Expertise is a 6 mana sorcery, draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control, then we can cast a spell with mana value 5 or less from our hand without paying its mana cost. Honestly, Rishkar's Expertise has been one of my favorite card draw spells, as it's 2 spells in 1. It's card draw, and we get a free spell afterwards. Next is the classic Regal Force. When Regal Force enters the battlefield, draw a card for each green creature you control. Pretty self-explanatory. Then we have things like Harmonize, Soul's Majesty, and Shamanic Revelation. Harmonize just allows us to draw 3 cards. Soul's Majesty draws cards equal to the greatest power among creatures we control, so it's Rishgar's expertise for 1 less mana, but we don't get to cast that extra spell. In Shamanic Revelation, draw a card for each creature you control, so it's like Regal Force except on a sorcery, but it has Ferocious. You gain 4 life for each creature you control, power 4 or greater. Next up, I wanted to talk about a suite of cards that Green has access to dealing with enchantments. Things like Enchantress's Presence, Argothian Enchantress, Citizen Champion, and Eidolon of Blossoms. All of these cards are going to draw us cards whenever an enchantment enters. Then we have cards where we're going to draw an attack, so that would be Toski, Bearer of Secrets, and Orin Frostfang. Toski can't be countered and is indestructible, and attacks each turn if able. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage, draw a card, and Orin Frostfang gives our attacking creatures Death Touch. Whenever a creature you control deals damage to a player, draw a card. The next section is creatures entering, so that's Beast Whisperer, Glimpse of Nature, Soul of the Harvest, and Garruk's Pack Leader. Beast Whisperer is whenever we cast a creature, so they don't actually have to enter. Glimpse of Nature is a 1-mana sorcery. Whenever we play a creature, we draw a card. Soul of the Harvest is a nice 6/6 body with trample. Whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield, so we don't actually have to cast it, it can just enter if we have some sort of flicker effect. Garruk's Pack Leader, we draw a card whenever a creature with power 3 or greater enters the battlefield. Next up is the enchantment section. So that's Guardian Project, Elemental Bond, and Garruk's Uprising. Guardian Project, whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control, draw a card. So Guardian Project, obviously Commander is singleton, so we're not going to run into that issue. Elemental Bond is Garruk's Pack Leader on an enchantment, and Garruk's Uprising is actually one of my favorites, as it draws us a card when it enters if we have a creature with power 4 or greater. It gives our entire board trample, which is really useful in mono green. Whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters, we draw another card. So it draws on enter, so it replaces itself, hopefully. It gives our whole board trample, and it continues to draw us cards. And last up is the Sacrifice section. So that's Momentous Fall at instant speed and Greater Good. Both being at 4 mana, Momentous Fall requires that we sacrifice a creature. We draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power, then we gain life to its toughness. So it's kind of this modal spell. In Greater Good, sacrifice a creature, draw cards equal to its power, then discard 3 cards. So maybe we can do something with our graveyard, but Greater Good is nice because it's an effect that stays around, whereas these other cards are usually these one-off effects. And honestly, this video is getting pretty long-winded, so I'm going to try and wrap it up as best I can. But what goes along with drawing a lot of cards is tutoring for specific cards that you need. And Green actually has a lot of ways to help us find the right card for the right time. First off, we're going to talk about Tooth and Nail, Defense of the Heart, and Wild Pair. Tooth and Nail will be an expensive sorcery that allows us to search our library for 2 creatures and reveal them and put them into our hand, and then if we pay the Entwine cost, we can put them onto the battlefield. Defense of the Heart is an enchantment that during our upkeep, if one of our opponents controls 3 or more creatures, we can go tutor for our 2 creatures, put them onto the battlefield. Wild Pair is an enchantment. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand, you may search your library for a creature card with the same total power and toughness and put it onto the battlefield. Next up, we're going to talk about Finale of Devastation, Chord of Calling, and Green Sun Zenith. These 3 cards have X in their mana cost. It allows us to pay mana into them to go and tutor for a creature with converted mana cost X or less and put it onto the battlefield. And lastly, we're going to talk about Natural Order and Birthing Pod. These 2 make us sacrifice a creature to go and find a creature and put it out on the battlefield. And lastly, we're going to talk about the classic green tutor, Worldly Tutor. 1 green for an instant, search for a creature, reveal that card, put it on top. I'm sure you're all familiar with Worldly Tutor. And to round out our tutor list, we have some, maybe they're lesser tutors, but I wanted to talk about them. Things like Vivian, Monster's Advocate. You can -2 Vivian the next time you cast a creature. We go and look for a creature with lesser converted mana cost. Fauna Shaman, 1 green, tap Fauna Shaman, discard a creature, search our library for a creature, put it into our hand. So it doesn't tutor it onto the battlefield, but it does get it to our hand, which is pretty nice. Shared Summons, 5 mana for an instant, which is pretty nice, casting a card at instant speed right before your turn. Search your library for up to 2 creature cards with different names, reveal them, put them in your hand. And Summoner's Pact, which is the green, 0 mana. Search your library for a green creature card, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. At the beginning of your next upkeep, pay 4 mana. If you don't, you lose the game. So there were actually a lot more green tutors than I remembered, but I still didn't touch on every single tutor. These are just the ones that I thought deserved a mention, so if you like other tutors, make sure to leave them in the comments below. But now after we've drawn cards and we've tutored, we can put down our huge beaters. But something that green struggles with is giving haste. And there are only really a few options that I found in mono green, but in my opinion are worth it, as we can put down all the threats we want and then give them haste to swing out to our heart's content. And that would be the Uvenwald Oddity. When it transforms into its flip side, it gives all of our creatures haste, and the Concordant Crossroads, which gives everything haste. I actually do run Concordant Crossroads in a couple of my decks, and I do think that the payoff of giving our stuff haste as well as giving everybody else's things haste, it is a little scary if a player goes off and they make a huge board and they kill everyone. Obviously that's not good, but I found with Concordant Crossroads, it's more of a political piece, and you can barter with the table and say that you're the one giving everything haste. Not that you shouldn't be attacked, but everyone likes having haste, and obviously if they kill you, they lose all of their haste, and it's more often beneficial to you, as you know when you're going to play it and what you're going to do with it. Because if you drop a Concordant Crossroads and then that turn you make a bunch of tokens or whatnot, everything you have has haste on your turn, and you can try and close the game from there. Another area that I'd like to address in green is ways to protect our board as a whole, or single targets, with spells like Heroic Intervention and Asceticism. Will protect everything, so Heroic Intervention obviously gives hexproof and indestructible, one of green's classic, almost answers to Teferi's protection is how good it is in universal. Asceticism, being 5 mana, gives creatures you control can't be the targets of spells or abilities our opponents control, which is nice, and it comes with the added benefit of 2 mana, regenerate target creature. And next up is going to be the single target protection spells, things like Tamiyo's Safekeeping, Tyvar's Stand, and Blossoming Defense. So these are 1 mana instants that is either going to give hexproof or indestructible to something, so that way it can't be targeted. And a card that I want to mention here, I really like Slippery Bogbonder. I know that it's 4 mana, so it's kind of tough to leave that 4 mana up all the time, but it has flash, it has hexproof, it's a 3/3, and when it enters the battlefield, we put a hexproof counter on target creature. Then move any number of counters from among creatures you control onto that creature. So Slippery Bogbonder kind of does a lot for us, and giving a hexproof counter means that it doesn't gain it that 1 instance, it just has hexproof as long as that counter is there. And lastly, we're going to talk about Alpha Authority and Sylvan Safekeeper. Alpha Authority is an enchantment, it gives our creature hexproof and can't be blocked by more than 1 creature, so we can try and get in for some damage. And Sylvan Safekeeper is a 1 mana 1/1. Sacrifice a land, target creature you control gains Shroud until end of turn. Especially in green, we're going to be playing a lot of ways to play lands from our graveyard, and we're going to want those extra lands from our graveyard, especially if we don't have them in our hand or we don't have ways to tutor them. Sylvan Safekeeper is a perfect way to protect our best thing and then continue to play lands and get our landfall triggers. Well, the more I looked through all green has to offer, I'm starting to think that this color has little to no downsides. Getting things back from the graveyard, maybe? That could be something that green struggles with. Well, with cards like Huatao, Eternal Witness, and Timeless Witness, that's probably not an issue. Huatao is interesting. It's a legendary creature for 3 mana. Tap him, put target creature from your graveyard on top of your library. Activate only during your turn before attackers are declared, so it's pretty restrictive, but it puts a card on top of our library. Eternal Witness and Timeless Witness are pretty self-explanatory. You know these cards and probably play them in a lot of your EDH decks. Next up is Regrowth, Bala Ged Recovery, and Noxious Revival. So Regrowth, pretty classic, you're just returning a card from your graveyard to your hand. Bala Ged Recovery does the same thing for an extra mana, but also flips into a land if we need it. And Noxious Revival. It's an instant, it's 1 green mana or 2 life, so it's 1 green Phyrexian mana. Put target card from a graveyard on top of its owner's library. So let's say if somebody tutors, they put a card on top of their library, or if you're trying to hose an opponent and you don't want them to get any card advantage, you can use Noxious Revival and put something like a land or a small creature on top of their library so you know what they're drawing for their turn, or you can use it obviously to get back your game-ending spells. And the last one I want to talk about is Life from the Loam. This is a 2 mana sorcery. Return 3 target land cards from your graveyard to your hand. Again, it's going to be really nice to hit those landfall triggers, and it has Dredge 3. So if we would draw a card, instead, we may mill exactly 3 cards from the top of our library into our graveyard, and if we do, we return Life from the Loam to our hand. So it's a good way to fill our own graveyard and get lands back with just 1 card. Green seems to be answering all of my concerns as a deck builder. Even discussing the color's shortcomings, green still has a solid, maybe not the most effective, but definitely solid ways to answer its issues, while being able to meet or exceed in every other area. It may be my opinion, but I think I'm safe to say that green is the strongest color in Magic the Gathering, and if you feel different, don't be afraid to call me out in the comments below. But after I just made a bold statement, let's wrap up this video by going over some of the best cards in green that I still haven't even mentioned, as well as cards that green uses to end the game. Some special cards in green. First one I want to talk about is Return of the Wild Speaker, which I've used in many of my decks. It's a 5-mana instant, but we can either draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-humans we control, or non-human creatures get +3/+3 until end of turn. So this can be used as an Anthem effect at instant speed, or it can draw us cards to keep us in the game. Next up is Parallel Lives and Doubling Season. Again, these are two cards that green is super famous for. Parallel Lives is going to make, if an effect would make one or more tokens, we make twice that many tokens. Doubling Season does the same thing for tokens and counters. Next up is Second Harvest, and I wanted to talk about this because it's an instant, so for each token we control, create a token copy that's a copy of that permanent. So our treasures, our clues, our creatures, we cast this on an opponent's end step right before our turn, we get double treasures, double clues, and double creatures, and we can swing out and try and end the game. I think Second Harvest is really overlooked. It's a little expensive, but again, if we're making a lot of tokens, this card is perfect for us. And lastly, two of green's biggest, most impactful spells are going to be the Great Henge and Nyx Bloom Ancient. The Great Henge costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures we control. It taps for 2 green and gains 2 life, and whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield, we put a +1/+1 counter on it, and we draw a card. The Great Henge is probably one of the best green cards ever printed. Nyx Bloom Ancient, so for 7 mana, it's a 5/5 with trample. If you tap a permanent for mana, it produces 3 times that much mana instead. So Nyx Bloom Ancient basically just brings us into the end game, and all of our lands or mana dorks are basically just going to tap for an absurd amount of mana, and we're going to find a way to win the game from there. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the game enders. So I'm just going to put all of them up on screen now, and you pretty much know what they do. They're pretty classic green spells. I don't really need to touch on them a whole lot because, again, you've probably lost to them enough times. So that's things like Craterhoof Behemoth, Overrun, Beastmaster's Ascension, Overwhelming Stampede, and Triumph of the Hordes. These cards are just going to be Anthem effects that allow our creatures to get bigger and trample over our opponents and take them out. And lastly, I want to talk about Zopandrel, Hunger Dominus, and Unnatural Growth. These two things, basically at the beginning of combat, they are going to double our creature's power and toughness. Again, if we have Trample tacked on, or if we just have a large enough board, we just double all our power and toughness, go to combat, swing out, and just punch our opponents in the face. So that's actually going to do it for the Mono Green video. I noticed that this video went much longer than the other 2 videos before this. And that might go to show that green just has so much going for it. It can tutor, it can draw cards, it puts down big beaters, it has small dorks. It's the only color that has access to true extra land ramp and getting lands into our hand. And on top of everything, green just answers every question that we have. It's so solid in every area of Magic the Gathering. If you pair green with another color, that color instantly just gets better because you have access to all this ramp and these dorks. So I personally think that playing a mono-colored deck, green is such a solid choice, and there's a reason that green is such a good choice for newer players to learn Magic, because green is going to give us access to the fundamentals of the game, whereas a more challenging color like blue or red, you're not going to have as easy of a time getting access to ways that you can actually play the game. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like what I'm trying to do here. I'd love to read all your comments. I try and respond to every one of them. And again, just if you're not subscribed, I encourage you to subscribe. I'm trying to hit my goal of 1,000 subscribers. And like I said at the beginning of this long-winded video, I would love to try and do a giveaway to all of you who are supporting me. So again, I am your friendly neighborhood green mage, and thanks for watching.